How does a woman marry 8 times and still spend her whole life searching for the one thing money and fame could never buy her? How does the most photographed face on the planet end up feeling, in her own words, like the loneliest person in any room she ever walked into? Millions of people watched Elizabeth Taylor from the outside and saw diamonds, mansions, film premieres, and those famous violet eyes that seemed to belong to a woman who had everything. Almost nobody watched from the inside. Almost nobody saw a little girl who was put to work before she understood what work even meant. A teenager who was never allowed to be awkward or ordinary. A young woman who learned that love, real or not, was the only thing that ever made the noise in her head go quiet. By the time she died in 2011, Elizabeth Taylor had been married 8 times to 7 different men. She had survived a plane crash that killed the man she loved most. She had been called a homewrecker by an entire country. She had been condemned by name from the pulpit of the Vatican's own newspaper. And she had also quietly changed the course of the AIDS crisis in America when almost nobody else in Hollywood was brave enough to say the word out loud. This is not just the story of a movie star. This is the story of a woman who turned heartbreak into a kind of religion, who kept walking back into the fire again and again, because some part of her still believed that this time, finally, it would be different. Stay with me, because before we get to the scandals that shocked the world, we need to go back to where it all began, in a quiet house in London, long before anyone knew the name Elizabeth Taylor. She was born on February 27, 1932, in Hampstead, London, to 2 American parents who had settled there. Her mother, Sarah, had once dreamed of her own career on the stage, and when that dream faded, she poured every bit of that ambition into her daughter instead. Elizabeth wasn't even 10 years old when her family moved to Los Angeles, right as the world was sliding into war, and it didn't take long before those unusual eyes of hers, framed by a genetic quirk that gave her a double row of eyelashes, caught the attention of people who made their living finding faces like that. By 9 years old, she had already signed her first studio contract. By 12, she was a global sensation, riding across the screen in National Velvet, a film that made her one of the most recognizable children on Earth almost overnight. But here's the part almost nobody tells you. While the world was falling in love with the little girl on the screen, the real little girl was disappearing. MGM owned her image, her time, her diet, her weight, even the story of who she was allowed to be in public. She wasn't going to school like other kids. She wasn't allowed to simply be bored, or clumsy, or awkward the way children are supposed to be while they figure out who they are. Every single day, from a shockingly young age, she was reminded that her value came from how she looked and how she performed. Think about that for a moment. Before she had even kissed a boy for the first time, she already understood, on some deep and unspoken level, that being loved and being useful were the same thing. That single belief, planted so early, would quietly shape almost every decision she made about love for the rest of her life. So when she married for the first time, in 1950 at only 18 years old, to hotel heir Conrad Nicky Hilton Jr., it wasn't really about him at all. It was about a young woman finally trying to build a life of her own, in a world that had never once let her make her own choices. It fell apart within 8 months. Behind closed doors, the marriage turned volatile, marked by heavy drinking and reported abuse, and Elizabeth walked away from it far more wounded than the public ever knew. But the studio needed its golden girl to keep shining, so the cameras kept rolling, and the world barely paused to ask what had actually happened. 2 years later, she married British actor Michael Wilding, a man nearly 20 years her senior, calm and steady in a way that felt, at least at first, like safety. They had 2 sons together, but steady wasn't the same as alive, and somewhere inside Elizabeth Taylor, a hunger was building that quiet stability could never satisfy. By 1956, that marriage too was ending, and this is where the story truly begins to catch fire, because the next man who walked into her life would be the one so many people, including Elizabeth herself, later called the great love of her life. His name was Mike Todd. He was a larger-than-life Hollywood producer, loud, magnetic, wildly confident, the kind of man who filled a room before he even said a word. And unlike the men before him, Todd didn't treat Elizabeth like a fragile ornament. He matched her intensity with his own. He didn't just love her, he adored her, publicly, loudly, extravagantly, showering her with jewelry and grand gestures that seemed almost theatrical, except that with Mike Todd, none of it felt fake. For the first time in her adult life, Elizabeth Taylor felt like she wasn't performing love. She felt like she was actually living it. They married in 1957. Within months, she gave birth to their daughter. By every account from the people who knew them, she was, for that brief window of time, genuinely, completely happy. But hold on to that feeling for a moment, because Hollywood was about to teach her the cruelest lesson of her life, that happiness this complete rarely gets to stay. On March 22, 1958, Mike Todd boarded his private plane, nicknamed the Lucky Liz after his wife, to fly to New York for an awards dinner in his honor. Elizabeth had planned to go with him. At the last minute, she stayed behind, sick with a cold. That plane crashed into a mountainside in New Mexico during a storm. There were no survivors. She was 26 years old, and in an instant, the man she believed she was going to spend the rest of her life with was gone. Try to imagine that phone call. Try to imagine being the woman the plane was named after, and realizing that the only reason you weren't on it was a common cold. Friends who saw her in the days that followed described a woman who had completely collapsed inward, someone who could barely speak, who seemed hollowed out from the inside. She did not simply grieve Mike Todd. Something in her changed permanently that day, a wound that never fully closed, and it would quietly shape every relationship that came after it. Because here is the devastating truth about grief like that. It doesn't just take away the person you lost. It takes away your ability to trust that love is safe to hold on to in the first place. And so, less than a year later, in a move that stunned and then infuriated the entire country, Elizabeth Taylor turned to the one person who had been standing beside her through the worst of that grief. Mike Todd's close friend, singer Eddie Fisher. There was just one enormous problem. Eddie Fisher was married to America's sweetheart, Debbie Reynolds, the wholesome, beloved star of Singin' in the Rain, a woman the entire country adored as the picture of innocence. When word got out that Fisher had left Reynolds for Taylor, the backlash was immediate and merciless. Almost overnight, Elizabeth Taylor went from America's grieving widow to one of the most hated women in the country. Magazine covers dragged her name through the mud. Fans who had once cried for her now spat at the mention of her name. She was branded a homewrecker, a seductress, a woman with no morals, while Eddie Fisher, the man who had actually made the choice to leave his marriage, faced a fraction of the public fury she did. Does that sound familiar? It should, because it's a pattern that would repeat again and again throughout her life, and honestly, throughout the history of how the public judges women versus men. She married Fisher in 1959. But this marriage, born out of grief and public rebellion rather than genuine partnership, was fragile from the very start. And soon, fate was about to hand her a role and a scene partner that would ignite the single biggest scandal Hollywood had ever witnessed. It happened on the set of a film so expensive it nearly bankrupted an entire studio, a film called Cleopatra. In 1962, Elizabeth Taylor arrived in Rome to play the Egyptian queen in a production so lavish, so chaotic, and so far behind schedule that it had already become a symbol of Hollywood excess before a single frame had even been released. Her co-star, playing Mark Antony, was a Welsh actor with a voice like velvet thunder and a reputation as one of the most electric stage performers of his generation. His name was Richard Burton. The moment the two of them shared a scene together, something happened that neither the studio, nor the public, nor even Elizabeth and Richard themselves could control. Crew members on set described a chemistry so raw it was almost uncomfortable to witness. The kind of tension that makes everyone in the room go quiet. Both of them were still married to other people. Neither of them cared. Word began leaking out almost immediately, and by the time the affair was confirmed, it wasn't just a Hollywood scandal anymore. It had become an international story. Newspapers around the world ran headlines about it. The Vatican's own newspaper publicly condemned Elizabeth Taylor, using the phrase erotic vagrancy to describe her behavior, an extraordinary moment where the Catholic Church itself weighed in on the private life of a movie star. A member of the United States Congress even brought up the affair on the floor of the House. Think about the sheer scale of that for a moment. A love affair between two actors became so consuming to the public imagination that it reached the halls of the Vatican and the United States government. And through all of it, Elizabeth and Richard kept right on falling deeper for each other, seemingly unable or unwilling to stop. Was it reckless? Absolutely. Was it also, according to nearly everyone who witnessed it firsthand, one of the most genuinely passionate connections either of them ever experienced? That's the part that made it so impossible for the public to look away. This wasn't just an affair. It was chaos and devotion tangled together so tightly that no one, least of all Elizabeth and Richard themselves, could ever fully separate the two. They divorced their respective spouses and married each other in 1964. For the next decade, Liz and Dick, as the tabloids endlessly called them, became the most famous couple on the planet, starring together in film after film, living an existence of yachts, jewels, five-star hotels, and a level of fame that no couple before them had ever quite experienced at that scale. But underneath the glamour, something darker was brewing. Both of them drank heavily. Both of them had volcanic tempers. Their fights became almost as legendary as their love, screaming matches in public restaurants, thrown objects, reconciliations just as intense as the arguments that came before them. It was passion and destruction, existing in the very same breath. By 1974, after 10 years of a love so consuming it had frightened even them, Elizabeth and Richard divorced. And then, in a twist that stunned even their most devoted followers, they remarried each other in 1975. Why would two people who had already broken each other's hearts once willingly walk right back into that fire? Maybe because some connections feel too enormous to simply walk away from, even when you know, deep down, that staying will hurt you. Maybe because Elizabeth Taylor, since that little girl who learned love equaled usefulness, since that young widow who lost Mike Todd without warning, had never learned how to let go of something that once made her feel that alive. The second marriage to Burton lasted less than a year. In 1976, they divorced for the final time, and this time there would be no third attempt. By now, the world had watched Elizabeth Taylor go through 5 husbands, a devastating loss, and the single biggest scandal in the history of Hollywood. And yet, remarkably, her story was still nowhere near over. Later that same year, she married John Warner, a Virginia politician who would go on to become a United States Senator. For a while, this marriage seemed to offer something different, a kind of quiet, respectable life far removed from film sets and tabloid chaos. But the isolation of political wife life in Washington, combined with the crushing loneliness of being away from the spotlight that had, in its own damaging way, given her identity for her entire life, took a serious toll. During this period, her weight fluctuated dramatically, and she began quietly struggling with something that would shadow her for years to come, an addiction to painkillers and alcohol. The marriage to Warner ended in 1982, and here is where the story takes one of its most human, most quietly courageous turns. In 1983, Elizabeth Taylor did something almost no major celebrity had ever done before. She checked herself into the Betty Ford Center, publicly, becoming one of the very first Hollywood stars to openly admit to a struggle with addiction and seek treatment for it. At a time when addiction was treated as shameful, as something to hide behind closed doors and carefully worded press statements, Elizabeth Taylor chose honesty instead. It cost her, in tabloid mockery and public judgment, but it also quietly gave permission to countless other people, famous and ordinary alike, to admit they needed help too. It was during a later stay at the Betty Ford Center in 1988 that she met the man who would become her 8th and final husband, a construction worker named Larry Fortensky. Their worlds could not have been more different, a movie icon and a blue-collar laborer, and when they married in 1991, at Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch of all places, the press treated it as one final punchline in the long-running joke of Elizabeth Taylor's love life. But maybe, just maybe, this marriage wasn't about spectacle at all. Maybe, after decades of chasing intensity, of mistaking chaos for connection, Elizabeth Taylor was finally searching for something simpler. That marriage ended in divorce in 1996, and she never married again. 8 marriages, 7 men, a lifetime spent again and again walking toward love with her whole heart wide open, even after it had been broken more times than most people could survive once. But if you think her story is only about husbands, you are missing the most important chapter of all. Because in the mid-1980s, as the AIDS crisis began devastating the gay community in America, and as most of the country, including most of Hollywood, responded with silence, fear, or outright cruelty, Elizabeth Taylor did something extraordinary. Her close friend, actor Rock Hudson, revealed in 1985 that he was dying of AIDS, at a time when the disease was so stigmatized that even hospitals sometimes refused to properly treat patients. Rather than distancing herself the way so many others did, Elizabeth Taylor stepped directly into the fire. She co-founded the American Foundation for AIDS Research, and later established the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation, pouring millions of dollars, and more importantly, her own enormous fame and credibility into a cause that most public figures were terrified to touch. She sat beside dying men when many of their own families wouldn't. She testified before Congress. She used the very same spotlight that had once made her the most hated woman in America, to instead become one of the most important voices in the fight against a disease that was killing thousands while the government largely looked away. Isn't that remarkable, when you think about it? The woman once condemned by the Vatican's own newspaper became one of the fiercest moral voices of her generation, fighting for people that almost nobody else in her position was willing to publicly stand beside. In her final decades, Elizabeth Taylor's body slowly began to betray her. A back injury from years earlier led to a series of surgeries. She battled skin cancer, a benign brain tumor, congestive heart failure, and spent her final years largely out of the public eye, though never entirely out of it, still occasionally appearing, still unmistakably herself, still radiating that same unforgettable presence even from a wheelchair. She passed away on March 23, 2011, at the age of 79, due to congestive heart failure. The world mourned her as a screen legend, as one of the last true icons from Hollywood's golden age. But maybe the truest way to understand Elizabeth Taylor isn't as a legend at all. Maybe it's as a little girl who was handed a level of fame before she was even old enough to understand what fame would cost her, who spent the rest of her life searching, marriage after marriage, heartbreak after heartbreak, for the one feeling that had been taken from her before she ever had the chance to choose it for herself. The simple, ordinary feeling of being loved for who she was, rather than for who the world needed her to be. 8 marriages were never really about vanity, or scandal, or an inability to commit. They were the visible evidence of a woman who refused to stop believing in love, even after love had broken her heart more times than most people could ever survive once. She was called reckless. She was called immoral. She was condemned by newspapers, by governments, even by the church. But underneath every single headline was a woman who felt everything with an intensity most of us will never understand, who loved without protecting herself, who grieved without hiding it, and who, when the world turned its back on people that fear had made untouchable, turned toward them instead. So maybe the real question isn't how Elizabeth Taylor could marry 8 times. Maybe the real question is how she kept finding the courage to try again, every single time, after everything the world and her own heart had already put her through. And maybe that, more than the diamonds, more than the films, more than the scandals that once filled every front page in America, is the story that actually deserves to be remembered.